Okay, again, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Lisa Matthews with EPA's Office of Research and Development, and thank you for joining us for today's EPA Tools and Resources webinar on identifying lead service lines in the community. Closed captioning is available for today's webinar. You can click on live transcript and then show subtitle or hide subtitle to enable and disable the captions. If you have a related science question during or after the presentation, please type it into the Q&A window at any time. And once the presentation ends, we will answer as many questions as time allows. EPA plans to post today's PowerPoint presentation and recording to our website within 2 weeks. The URL to our webpage will be sent in a follow-up email. Legacy lead service lines represent the greatest source of lead in drinking water. Lead service line identification is the first step to their removal, which is a national priority. This webinar will provide an overview of methods that have been used for lead service line identification, including record screening, basic visual examination, water sampling, excavation, and others. I am pleased to introduce our presenter today, Dr. Simone Triantafillou with EPA's Office of Research and Development in our Center for Environmental Solutions and Research in Environmental Solutions and Emergency Response. I always get that acronym messed up. We call it CSER, and she's based in Cincinnati, Ohio. So Simone, thank you so much, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you so much, Lisa. Thank you for introducing me, and welcome everybody to this webinar on identifying lead service lines in the community.
You just muted, Simone.
Trying to move on to my next slides here, having a bit of a technical difficulty, but I think we got this. There you go. So this is our roadmap for the webinar today. We're going to start off with the challenge of legacy lead service lines, or LSLs. We're going to move on to some lead service line identification tools and specifically pros and cons of each. And I will then introduce to you our suggested stepwise lead service line identification approach as a framework to identify lead service lines or start a service line inventory. I'll then present some examples, basically 2 case studies to see how that framework fit to different situations. And I'll then sum up all the information. And at the very end of my slides, I will offer you some other resources from our broader EPA ORD lead and copper corrosion research team, not just specific to lead service line identification, but on lead and copper in general, in case some other topics are also of interest to you. And before I start my presentation, I'd also like to point out that some of the slides might be busier than some others, but I really wanted to give you enough detail if you ever want to go back to your files and to this presentation to have enough information there, although we might not necessarily go over all of the details on the slides today. So, all right, I think we all know the issue of lead service lines or lead goosenecks. Those were allowed or even required by municipal plumbing codes back in the day before the 1986 Safe Drinking Water Act lead ban. And here's just some illustrative older municipal code language with the yellow highlights basically showing excerpts where lead pipe was explicitly mentioned as the material either required or allowed for service lines or goosenecks. So we're in the situation now where around the country we have millions of legacy lead and lead pipes still around. They are the primary contributors to water lead contamination when they're present. And in case you haven't seen any of them, this is what they might look like. On the top left, you can see a full lead service line in the ground. In the middle, you can see a partial lead service line. So we basically have this part here be the lead pipe connected with a new copper pipe with a white leaded solder joint. And on the top right, you can see a lead lined iron service. Those were common in some parts of the country. And the pipe here has been cut to expose the lead lining inside, and that's the interior surface of the pipe that would come into contact with flowing drinking water. At the bottom left, we have a lead gooseneck, a much shorter segment of lead pipe in some areas of the country that used to be the main connector of the water main to the service line. And you can also see at the bottom right a galvanized pipe. So what constitutes a lead service line? The definition may differ depending on context. So I'd just like to remind everyone of the regulatory definition under the federal lead and copper rule revisions, which were finalized in 2021, including a requirement for drinking water utilities to prepare their initial service line inventories by 2024. The requirement is under the LCRR for utilities to identify both the public side and the private side of service lines into 4 categories: lead service lines, or LSLs, galvanized requiring replacement, GRR, so galvanized pipe downstream of lead, then lead status unknown service lines, and non-lead service lines. The US EPA's Office of Water also published their guidance for developing and maintaining a service line inventory earlier in the year. So I'm offering you the link at the bottom and the glossary used in that document on the right of this slide here. So what do we know about lead service lines nationally? There have been a couple of national surveys. A previous survey by the American Water Works Association estimated around 9 to 10 million lead service lines and goosenecks together. And the most recent American Water Works Association survey estimated 6.1 million partial or full lead service lines. As with any big national survey, there's some challenges in those estimates. The level of detail is one, the low response rates in the surveys is another, or the quality of the information based on which responses were given to the survey, including utility records, whether they were incomplete or inaccurate, for example. And of course, the theme of the previous slide, how is the lead service line defined? Because these estimates here do not account for galvanized pipe, for example. If we look at what states have been doing even before the lead and copper rule revisions, there have been some requirements for lead service line inventories in a handful of states. And I've tried to summarize the information here in this table. So you can see we have Wisconsin, we have Ohio, Illinois, California, Michigan, and New Jersey with requirements for inventories even before the LCRR. And then I added another column to the right-hand side of this slide with the federal lead and copper revision requirements, again, due in fall 2024. Here, I just wanted to point out, and I was inspired by a previous similar table created by ASDWA, the Association of State Drinking Water Administrators, which kind of shows different language used for different inventories and different kind of requirements from different states. For example, if you look at the state of California, you can see that it didn't include a requirement to capture the private side of a service line, unlike other states, but it did include a requirement to capture lead goosenecks, which might not be the case in other inventories in other states. Even the way that unknowns were meant to be reported differed between the different states. So if we look at actual numbers, this is a cumulative pie chart, let's say, with states that have a history of lead service lines. Our colleagues in EPA Region 3 and Region 5 and another colleague at EPA's Office of Research and Development came together to look at publicly available data. And this pie chart here incorporates data from Michigan, Illinois, Wisconsin, and Indiana from the years 2018 to 2020. So it doesn't include any updated information after that, but it does offer kind of a general idea of what's happening in some parts of the country, where you can see here from the pie chart, 13% of service lines were lead for these 4 states. That's the red slice of the pizza here. And an even bigger percentage, 16% for these 4 states, were unknown service line materials that may be lead. And that translated to literally millions of service lines. If we now look at a different part of the country, this is California. So that's a state without a long history of lead service lines, where you can see that the situation differs quite a bit. The data here were publicly available from the state of California from 2018. And again, any updated information since then is not reflected. But practically, there were almost 0% lead service lines in the state of California, and a small percentage of lead fittings, and a small percent of unknowns in terms of fittings, meaning goosenecks or service lines. So we have kind of different sides of the coin here, depending on which part of the country you are from. So the uncertainties in the estimates or the unknown service line materials really kind of made us think about this. And we published a paper back in 2021 on lead service line identification, a review of strategies and approaches that I'll go over today with you, really looking at the identification tools for service line materials that the drinking water industry had in our disposal, going over the relative pros and cons, and at the very end, introducing the stepwise lead service line identification approach to hopefully help folks with their own efforts. So these are the general categories of tools that we looked into. We started with preliminary records screening. We moved then to community records, so more specific, more local records compared to the broader, kind of more historical preliminary records screening above. And we then moved to basic and or visual examination of service lines, to tap sampling approaches at the kitchen faucet, and to excavation. We did look into some other categories of tools, including predictive methods, like artificial intelligence models, for example. And we did look into some alternative methods, and I'll go through those as well. Starting with preliminary records review, these are basically the phase out dates by state after the 1986 Safe Drinking Water Act lead ban. So this is just a part of a table that I copied from Appendix D of US EPA's guidance for developing and maintaining a service line inventory, showing the dates effective of the ban for every single state. So you see that column highlighted right here. And going through all of the states, basically lead service lines were banned starting from 1986, so the year of the Safe Drinking Water Act lead ban, to 1991 in all cases, to several years after that. So depending on which state you're at, this is kind of a good starting point to get an idea of when lead pipes stopped being used in service lines. When we looked into community records, there were all sorts of different categories for those. Those might include service line installation records, for example, top cards, like the 2 examples here from a Midwestern drinking water utility where lead was explicitly mentioned as the service line material. But we might also have inspection and maintenance records, replacement or repairs, plumbing permits, meter installation records, property taxes, maps and drawings of the system, and potentially many others. The caution with these, first of all, are they available? Are they legible? Are they complete? Meaning, they have all the details and enough information in there to be able to make the determination whether a service line is made out of lead or not. And are they accurate and up to date? For example, will they reflect a partial replacement if that ever happened after the initial top card was created? Basic visual examination is kind of a next step here. We can either rely on residents to perform this, or utility personnel can do this. This is possible if the service line is accessible, let's say at the residential basement. And in that case, if the service line is visible, when scratched, let's say with a coin, then the exposed pipe surface area if shiny silver and flaking off, that would be indicative of a lead service line. We can also use a magnet, which will not stick to lead, but will stick to galvanized pipe, for example. So that approach can help us identify a solid lead service line, although it would still not tell us whether we have a lead-lined iron pipe. We can also use a lead test kit, like the swab kits that are available for lead paint, which change color after contacting lead surfaces. The National Public Radio a few years ago had some advice for residents on how to identify lead pipes in homes, and the link to that is offered below. And more recently, the EPA in 2021 also published a guide to help folks identify lead service lines in their homes, and the link is also offered at the bottom here. Moving to drinking water sampling at the top, there's a few approaches that can potentially be suitable for lead service line identification with some caveats. Let's start with sequential or as profile sampling, which you might have heard of before. Basically, this involves the collection of sequential water samples from a kitchen faucet. On the schematic on the left, you see an example of what that might look like, collecting water on water bottles 1 through 10 in this specific schematic, which really is meant to capture water all the way through the water main, including the service line. You then analyze these water samples for lead in water. You come up with profiling graphs like the one on the right, where you can see lead on the y-axis and cumulative water volume on the x-axis. And depending on the lead peaks you identify, you can actually assess whether that home had a lead service line or not. And you can actually identify other lead sources as well, but the focus here is lead service line. So for example, in this specific graph here, you do have a prolonged cumulative water volume where lead concentrations are high, and this here is indicative of a service line of a lead service line in this specific example. Utilities have used this approach. These are just some examples offered here at the bottom of the slide. Denver Water was one of them. DC Water was another, where I'm just summarizing the approach and the false negative rate for your awareness, just to illustrate that none of the approaches is 100% accurate or bulletproof, and there might be false negatives associated with them. There's two types of sampling approaches that might work for lead service lines. Aside from the previous approach, they are flashed samples and what we call targeted samples. So flashed samples are actually fairly simple to collect. They're much easier than profile samples because we're only talking about typically a single sample collected after a standardized time of flushing. And the idea here is that we're flushing all the water in the plumbing line until the water main, but still the water that we are capturing has some trace of lead in it if that residence has a lead service line. This has been approached by some systems in the past, and it has worked well, for example, in Canadian water systems and in Denver Water. And then for the targeted samples, these are also simpler than the sequential or else profile sampling approaches, but you need to have a good understanding of where the lead service line or the service line is in the plumbing line, because you need to flush out enough volume of water to then be able to capture in your water sample water that had been contained within the service line. This has been used in a few cases, and here I'm just offering the Cartier et al. 2012 example from Canada. The caution with these approaches is that there's specific sampling approaches that will work for lead service line identification. And for those, you'll need community-specific lead service line identification water lead thresholds. If you look at the examples that I posted above on this slide and even on the previous one, these thresholds are different for different systems. Generally, for tap water sampling, if corrosion control treatment of the system is truly optimized, or if lead-4 chemistry is controlling, then tap sampling might be not as useful in identifying lead service lines because lead concentrations measured in samples will be fairly low due to the adequacy of CCT or the good lead-4 scales on lead pipes. sorry about that. Moving to mechanical excavation. This is really the golden standard here. It's the most expensive, the most disturbing approach, but is also the most reliable and the one that offers the highest accuracy rate relative to other excavation methods, because a longer length of the service line is exposed. It might be up to 10 feet in some instances. The concern with this approach is the cost and the time and the disturbance, especially in cases where service lines are dug up that are actually not lead and they have to be reburied. So vacuum excavation is a different approach for excavation. Let's look at hydrovac, for example, and you can see in the photo hydrovac track. That consists of a high pressure water jet, an industrial vacuum. The jet basically loosens the soil. The vacuum removes it so that the service line is exposed and that it can then be visually identified. This causes smaller holes, it's less expensive, it has less disturbance. But the challenge with that is what happens in cases of heterogeneous service lines, partial replacements, for example, where exposing just a very small area of the pipe might not really tell you what's happening in the rest of the pipe length. So here's the table of relative pros and cons of lead service line identification methods. You can see at the very left, this is the list of methods that I went through previously. So we're starting with community records review, moving on to basic visual observations, then to water quality sampling, either flashed, sequential, or targeted. And then we move on to excavation, either mechanical or vacuum. And we basically split the evaluation into different categories, starting with utility cost, not just financial, but also the time, the on-site time during tool utilization, but also the time needed to pre-plan or the time needed post. Let's say for drinking water sampling approaches, the time needed to analyze samples and get the results back. We also looked into disturbance to the service line and to the traffic flow, impacts to homeowners such as water service disruption, property damage, and homeowner involvement. The skills required for interpretation of the results, obviously the labor, and most importantly, the overall time and accuracy of each approach. And we used a relative scale here from low to medium to high. And you will see that for some of the categories, there might be really broad ranges. For example, if we look at the community records review, the accuracy here is listed from low to high. And that's because it really depends on the specific community. If they have really good, reliable top cards that are up to date, legible, available, then surely this approach will have a higher accuracy. But if that top cards are mostly missing, or if they're there, but they're not very detailed or informative, or if they're not legible, then that accuracy might be lower. This table was created with feedback from drinking water utilities, and it might be possible that other drinking water utilities using some of the same tools might have had different experiences also. So we're constantly looking at improving this information. So here's the suggested stepwise service line identification approach that I mentioned in the outline. The idea here is for a system having unknown service line materials to basically start with the simplest approaches. And each time you move down to the next step, you move to a step that's a little bit more complicated, more costly, but hopefully will give you more information than the step right before it, until all the way to excavation, which is the most kind of complex and costly approach. Now, there's some disclaimers on this, that adopting the approach in its entirety really assumes availability of resources and need, because it might be possible that not all these steps are needed or useful for a specific community. But generally, the approach is to start with records review. That's kind of the first step. The more historical, kind of higher level records for a preliminary review, and then the more local community records, such as top cards. Moving on to the on-site basic and visual examination, to then the specific tap water sampling approaches that I mentioned previously, all the way to excavation. And there are other methods too that I haven't mentioned yet. that have been used for lead service line identification in some communities. So I would like to spend a little bit of time talking about them. The predictive methods you might have heard about, these are basically models that use geospatial information, oftentimes combined with machine learning to make predictions. So basically the models use information that's already known in a community. So let's say locations where there are known lead service lines, and they can make predictions for unsampled sites. And the more information that's coming into the model, the better predictions the model is going to be able to make, and it's going to be able to learn from those spatial patterns that exist in a specific community. The thing here with these models is that they're really relying on the data inputs. So all of the different lead service line identification tools that I mentioned previously, those are the primary the sources of the primary information, which can then get input into these models to make predictions. So there's a question about the quality of the data that comes in and the confidence in the predictions that the model makes. Also, if you'd like to know more about these approaches, there's some resources here at the bottom to read afterwards. There are some alternative methods as well. Oftentimes these are called no-dig tools. Some of them have had, to a certain extent, lab or field evaluation for the purpose of lead service line identification specifically, but some are at this point kind of conceptual or theoretical, and they have been used in other industries for other purposes, let's say for leak detection. So the ones that have had some lab and field evaluation are electrical resistance, acoustic wave and eddy current, and some other theoretically, conceptually possible approaches to identify lead service lines are metal detectors and ground penetrating radar. We didn't look into those for our pros cons table and our stepwise identification approach because not a lot of information was available about their application specifically for the purpose of lead service line identification in the drinking water industry. Although again, some of these have been used in other industries for other purposes. And for the ones that have been assessed for lead service line identification, they have had some lab and field evaluation, but still not that much information that we felt comfortable presenting. Speaking of alternative methods, one that we thought was attractive was what we call the cumulative sampler. It's basically a passive sampler. It's nothing else than a point of use filter that can be installed in the kitchen tap, used by the manufacturer. So reduce lead from tap water, and then at the end of the lifetime of the filter, be returned to the lab for analysis. And the idea is that all of the lead captured within the filter, if extracted back, it can give us an idea whether that home had a lead service line or not, because the hypothesis is that if the average lead mass in a home is fairly high, that's indicative of a lead service line relative to a home that never had a lead service line and should have a much, much lower lead mass trapped in that filter. Through a different American Water Works Association volunteer group, we also looked into the experiences of 10 North American water systems with their inventories. And this is a link to the article describing all the information. I would like to kind of show this highlight, again, a lot of information on this slide, because this is a table of the 10 systems that were interviewed for the purposes of that volunteer work group and the article that we published. But the idea here is just to demonstrate, and these are all large systems in the United States and in Canada. So you can see the water system name, the water system location, the number of service connections, estimations for lead service lines, what was their corrosion control treatment, and what tools they used for lead service line identification. So that column right here is probably the most important one. But I just wanted to really, on a very high level, just point out that they all started with records review across this whole table. That was kind of the first step. And after that, you can see different combinations of tools used by different systems. For example, if you look at the Canadian systems, which are kind of in the middle of this table, in the city of Montreal and the city of Guelph, you can see that they relied on water quality sampling interestingly, none of these systems have corrosion control treatment. So water sampling worked well for the purpose of lead service line identification. Unlike, for example, the Greater Cincinnati Waterworks, which is on the first row of this table, which is a system with lead-4 protective scales on the pipes where water sampling actually didn't work really well and they relied on other approaches. So it's really interesting to just learn from the experiences of those systems. And I did want to also point out from that article just the amount of time and effort and staffing that was required for those systems to develop their inventories. And of course, they were all large systems, but basically the staff ranged anything from 2 to 3 full-time employees for a couple of months to several employees working continuously throughout that system's lead reduction program. In some cases, interns were hired in the summer, let's say to perform water sampling and other tasks. In some systems, customers were also engaged to perform water sampling or visual identifications. And even then, water system staff were made available to assist those customers, to gather information from the customers and to validate the information. I'm highlighting the case of Montreal, Canada, because they actually decided to accelerate their inventory efforts so that they can complete it in 2023. And you can see the difference in staffing requirements. Once they made that decision for acceleration, their dedicated staff increased from a couple of engineers and many, many interns to way more full-time staff, plus telephone operators, plus way more interns. So all these water systems really gave significant staff and time for at least some initial period of time. And again, these are large water systems. The level of effort and will vary, especially based on system size, the proportion of lead service lines. These were all systems that had a history of lead service lines, and on other factors as well, such as the availability and reliability of records and other needs and constraints. These are some frameworks that I figured I would share with you, some approaches for determination of service lines from the literature. On the left, you can see one such flow chart from the article that I just mentioned with these action verbs to basically start, compile information, review and analyze the information, verify the information, and then if it's reliable, to compile your inventory, otherwise develop a methodology to detect lead service line present. And as you can see, it's a loop. So this was kind of a common theme in the different kinds of frameworks. On the right here, you can see a different framework suggested at the US EPA's guidance for developing and maintaining a service line inventory. It's very similar with action verbs here, loops for continuous improvement, and evaluations and updates as well. Here's a few more approaches. On the left, you can see information from the lead service line replacement collaborative in the form of key questions to ask when starting the process of preparing an inventory. And on the right, this stepwise service line identification approach that I mentioned previously. But the whole point of these is that they might visually look a little bit different, but the framework, kind of the general idea, is roughly the same. And depending on how you best perceive information and what works better for you, you can pick some of these or all of these and then customize them and use them for your own needs. For my needs, what I did is I wanted to see if this stepwise identification approach that we had developed fit different systems, different communities. So I got some information from work done in Bennington, Vermont on lead service line identification, and I tried to see how it fit the stepwise approach. So you can see the steps here, and I'll give you a bit of background about that case study. Basically, Bennington, Vermont is a small town. It had lead service lines during a period of time. They were fortunate to receive state revolving funds to be able to conduct their inventory, and their initial records review indicated 40% of the service lines were lead or unknown. They then went to perform on-site basic visual examinations in the basement to observe service line materials entering the foundation. and potentially perform a swab test if the visual observation was not conclusive. But their inspections basically indicated that their records were not reliable. So they then moved to specific water analyses, flash samples and sequential profiling, and to partial excavation of service lines. This is just a very general highlighted approach. There's more details on this slide for anyone who would like to know more about this case study based on the presentation that was made, which I'm mentioning at the bottom of the slide. But the stepwise approach fit really well in the town of Pennington. Let's look at another city now in California. If you remember from previously, California doesn't have a long history of lead service lines. So here the steps might have been a little bit different. So the city's Pasadena, where lead pipes were not believed to be likely, but lead goosenecks were present. And that's what the preliminary records review kind of indicated. But when they looked into community records more closely, they didn't deem those reliable because they were not often available, legible, or sufficiently detailed. So instead, what they did was to group homes into risk categories based on their age for verification purposes, and then perform an on-site examination or else verification where about 1% of their high and highest risk homes were sampled. And then they swabbed a portion of the service line exposed to be able to say if it had lead service line or not. And here you can see a photo of the swab kit where it changes color to pink in the case of a lead gooseneck, but not for the case of stainless steel. Here's more details for California if you would like to have them for your files, although I'm not going to go into detail on those. But overall, based on the information that I have provided to you today, there is uncertainty in the estimates of lead service lines present, especially because of different and broadening definitions through the years. There's an increased need for lead service line inventories and in fact a requirement. But we can learn a lot from larger drinking water utilities and or utilities with state requirements that have already developed inventories. Based on their experience, there's a variety of lead service line identification tools that are available, and you can pick from based on various criteria. Some of the ones that we identified were the accuracy, the time, the cost, the skill, the disruption to the homeowner, and the disturbance. And as more utilities share their experiences, the pros and cons relating to all of these criteria will be better defined. In practice, there's different suggested frameworks, those flowcharts that I showed you that are available for lead service line identification. Useful to keep in mind is that those were primarily developed for communities with a history of lead service lines in mind, and that the value of them is really on the general framework they offer you, not on the specific details or in the specific steps or arrows or boxes, because those can be customized to your needs. The stepwise identification approach is one such suggested framework that we will keep refining. Based on the Vermont case study that I showed you, it demonstrated that no step of the approach is 100% accurate, short of full excavation. But although I didn't get to that, in this presentation, cost savings could actually be realized in steps prior to excavation, depending on regulatory approval. And the California case study, which was really a retrofit. So I took the experience of Pasadena and their approach to try and see if it could be fit back to the stepwise approach. It did demonstrate that the general logic can hold even in communities without a long history of lead service lines with step modifications. So that really, makes us go back to the fact that some parts of the country have a long history of lead service lines, whereas others do not. And that it's really useful to be aware of all the frameworks, approaches, and tools, and to customize those to meet specific needs. So how can this framework fit your needs? With that, here are some other resources on the lead and copper corrosion research that we've been doing at the EPA's Office of Research and Development. You can look those over at your leisure later. This is my contact information with acknowledgements to all my colleagues and other collaborators for the articles that I emphasized today, and all the other authors for the resources I'm citing herein. and another list of journal articles for your reading pleasure later. With that, thank you very much, and back to Lisa and Erin.
Thank you so much, Simone.